Greetings, my name is Maria Roussou and I will be speaking today about the role of data visualization, especially in times like these. Before I start, I'd like to thank the Open Conference team for inviting me at this exceptionally well organized and very fresh conference. Practically speaking, a data visualization presents data visually in a systematic way. That is mapping variables to visual encodings, for example, position along an axis, identifying the right geometric elements to represent data, for example, points, lines, areas, what have you, and reference elements, for example, axes. And essentially, visualization is suitable when there is a need to augment human cognition, human capabilities, so as to help us quickly understand and communicate complex information. So let's see a simple and very timely example. I'm sure that every one of you has heard about flattening the curve and has probably seen a diagram like this. This simple diagram has been a characteristic visual from the early days of the pandemic. The Economist showed a diagram, published a diagram like this in February 2020. It's based on a version that first appeared in 2007. There have since been hundreds of renditions of this graph, visualized in many creative ways, even animated, helping us further shape our understanding about what is going on. And in some cases, we have telling sketches like this one by a Greek cartoon artist that needs no words at all. So despite these many renditions, the chart is more or less what we see here. There's nothing particularly rigorous about it, nothing very scientific about it, but it has made it quite easy for anyone to understand where the problem lies. So what is it that makes this visualization so effective? Well, one of the reasons for the graph's staying power is that it appeals to certain universals of human perception. So let's dissect some of its elements and see. First of all, we're hardwired to understand visual cues. The bright red of the steep curve grabs our attention and signals danger, but the gentle, on the other hand, blue slope brings calm. Even with the use of other colors, we would still have a similar attention-grabbing effect due to the size difference between these two different humps. So the color just intensifies this difference. So one is tall and steep, representing the outcome of a pandemic in which no interventions are taken, and the other is flatter and shorter than the first, and it depicts the outcome under a community mitigation regime. These humps visually tap into our intuitive knowledge that short hill is better, thus easier, and that the tall hill is more difficult to climb. So the other elements of this graph are the axes and the legends. The x-axis is a general idea of time. The y-axis is a vague estimate of the number of cases. And then there's a line for healthcare capacity, which is rigid and dotted, but pretty inexact. Nevertheless, these axes lend an aura of scientific authority. And this line of representing the capacity of the healthcare system, we interpret that as a threshold. Don't go beyond it. So this is not a mere illustration. Charts are not illustrations, as Alberto Cairo, a professor in visual journalism, says. Charts are arguments. They tell a story, they make a statement, and this is exactly where the power of visualization lies. So let's see some more historical this time examples from times of epidemics in the past. Let's go back to 1854 when cholera broke out in London and no one knew how the illness spread. So a doctor at the time, his name was Dr. John Snow, mapped the locations of cases in the Soho neighborhood of London and showed that the illnesses were centered around a single water pump on Broad Street. So he plotted over 500 deaths in central London, as well as the locations of the water pumps. And this clearly showed that the deaths were centered around this one pump. And at the time, the infectious theory of disease was not generally accepted. So people thought that the disease spread through the air from dead bodies. But Snow thought that water was involved in the transmission of cholera. So he already had an idea what to look for, but he was with this diagram, with this visualization, he was able to prove this, to communicate it, and eventually to convince of his idea. Similarly, in 1858, a pioneering statistician and social reformer, her name was Florence Nightingale, she used this unique rose diagram to show that the primary cause of death for British soldiers in the Crimean War wasn't fatal wounds on the battlefield, but disease due to unsanitary living conditions. So her rose diagram shows the amount of deaths per months, and it is caused throughout the months, and it is very clear that preventable diseases shown in blue cause the great majority of deaths. So she was able, with this diagram, to convince, as well as with other diagrams, for example, this bar chart that she made to show that soldiers, even during peacetime back at home, were dying at roughly double the rate of civilians due to especially bad sanitation in the English barracks. So ultimately, her ideas around sanitation began to permeate the public and consciousness, and that led to health and sanitation reforms. So let's take a step back and see what makes or breaks a visualization. Healy says that it can be a matter of bad aesthetics, of deliberately bad use of data, or of bad perception. That means encoding data visually in such a way that it misleads us. Let's start with the aesthetics. Edward Tufte is considered the father of data visualization, and he talks about chart junk, all these flourishes that are added in a chart which clutter it without adding anything important, like in this case here, the little people, or in this case here, the image of a monster. It's added to this chart, which is titled Monstrous Cost, to intensify the point that it wants to get across. This has, of course, the positive aspect to it, that the chart really stays with us. We remember monstrous costs, but at the same time, it makes it harder to see the data in the chart. In this example, the use of 3D not only is useless, but adds a considerable amount of chart junk, including the shadows in the background, and it makes it quite difficult to see the numbers and understand these bars, the values of these bars. And here's another example of useless 3D. Here we have multidimensional data, but the use of 3 axes is unnecessary. Whereas in this case, we have an effective example of charting multi-dimensional data. Here it's showing cases of measles. The rows are different states of the United States, and the columns are different years. So the dark line is where the vaccine was introduced in 1963, and this gives a clear message. You can see that there was a large drop-off in the cases of measles after the vaccine was introduced. Of course, a little later, after 2003, you may be able to see that there is a little bit of a rise of an uptake of measles cases, and this is attributed to vaccine deniers. So in terms of aesthetics, less is more, and as Tufte says, above all else, show the data. How about the use of data? And in some cases, the deliberately bad use of data. Um, this is an example of a pie chart that does it all wrong. First, consistency between the position of the items on the legend and the color encoding is is not existent. So you probably looked at the orange or the yellow slice first and then moved clockwise around the pie. But the legend leads with the red square, getting coronavirus, which is what people are worried about, or one of the things they are worried about. And this is likely the last item you'll see on the chart. But most importantly, the problem here is that the three numbers in the chart sum up to 178%. And this is a rather common mistake that is made when survey questions allow each respondent to select more than one answer, more than one answers. So whenever more than one responses are accepted, one cannot use a pie chart, because in a pie chart you need mutually exclusive categories that add up to 100%. This is not the case here. If we were to draft this by using a different visual graph, a bar chart, for example, we would, with the same data, we could make it easy to see how they compare to each other. So bar charts are better the more categories you have, because then the slices of a pie chart get smaller and harder to discern. But here, simply a simple graph, a simple bar chart can do the trick without extra frills or other elements that may make us not understand what the data is. One of the easiest ways to misrepresent your data is by messing with the y-axis of a bar graph, a line graph, or a scatter plot. In most cases, the y-axis ranges from 0 to a maximum value that encompasses the range of the data. However, sometimes we change the range to better highlight the differences. And when that's taken to an extreme, this technique can make differences in data seem much larger than they are, like in this example, where the difference between 35% and 39%, approximately 39.6%, is not that big as it seems, that large as it seems through these bars. The bars show a huge difference, whereas in fact that's not there. And in this example, where we have truncated y-axis again, on the left, the value of the y-axis starts from 10. On the right, it starts from 0. Exact same data, but a different picture, a different story is shown from these two bar charts. And the same here. On the left, we've constrained the y-axis to range from 3.14% to 3.15% approximately, and doing so makes it look like interest rates are skyrocketing. And at a glance, the bar sizes imply that rates in 2012 are several times higher than those in 2008. But displaying the data with a zero baseline, as we do in the right picture, gives us a more accurate picture where interest rates are staying static. And here, one chart suggests that there is slow, steady growth. The other suggests rapid, steady growth. When you choose the values for the y-axis here, you are making a statement about what the user will see at their first impression, and you can't escape that. So charts are arguments, not just illustrations. Again here, the first panel shows a trend in the number of students beginning law school each year, and the y-axis starts from just below the lowest value in the series, and the second panel shows the same data but with the y-axis minimum set to 0 instead. Another way to mislead is messing with the height to make it seem much larger than it is. Here's an example, and here's another example. Again, we can mess with the y-axis to show a completely different story of the data in these two cases. And messing with size to make it seem much larger than it is. 30 is 3 times 10, but that big third rectangle looks a lot bigger than the first, and we might be trying to inflate significance, and if we do something like this. Messing with conventions is another way to mislead. This graph here, this visualization about wearing masks in Sweden, Denmark, and Norway and Scandinavian countries is really incomprehensible. It's really hard to understand where the axes are, what these positions, these colors, these shapes, these lines, and the position of the legend. All of these contribute to a very confusing story about this data. The choice of design and the choice of text can change completely the message that we give. So in the left visualization, which was made in 2011 by Simon Scar, it depicts the number of civilians that died in the Iraq conflict and how that's changed over time. And when we see it, we probably don't quite look at the numbers or see it in that way. Instead, we see the image, which is quite striking and symbolizing blood dripping down a wall. And so this got a lot of coverage at the time and debates about within the visualization community whether it was correct, whether it was ethical, or whether it was effective. A few years later, Andy Cotgrave in 2016 created the visualization we see on the right, and he just rotated 180 degrees, the first visualization, the left one. He changed the title, he changed the color, but he did not change the data. So the underlying numbers have not changed, but here you get a very different conclusion. The one on the left suggests that you need to pay attention to how bloody the war on Iraq was and the number of civilian casualties that arose from it. And the one on the right sends a different message that actually the number of deaths are on decline. So same data, different conclusions that are made out of these depictions here just because we changed the design or the text alone, not the underlying data. And this is another example with a different data set. So visualizations encode numbers and lines, shapes, and colors, and that means that our interpretation of these encodings is partly conditional on how we perceive geometric shapes and relationships generally, our visual perception of them. For example, in this Hermann grid effect, our visual system sees basically these blobs appearing at the intersection in the grid, but only as long as one is looking at them directly. So it's a side effect of the visual system. Many other attributes of our visual system and our perception can help or hinder the way we perceive visualizations. For example, in this case, the 3D aspect and the angle, the 3D columns in combination with the angle of view for this chart make the values as displayed differ substantially from the ones that are in the cell. So A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3, 4. But when we actually see the 3D angled graph, it's very hard to understand exactly each one of the A, B, C, Ds and which number they correspond to. Aspect ratios also affect our perception of rates of change. In the left side panel, the lines appear at first glance to be converging as the value of x increases. It seems like they might even intersect if we extended the graph out further. But in the right side panel, the curves are clearly equidistant from the beginning. So the data plotted in each panel are the same, but the apparent convergence in the left panel is just a result of the aspect ratio of the figure. Inconsistent proportion affects also our perception of values when the size has to be proportional to the quantity that it represents. Tufte said that the representation of numbers should be directly proportional to the quantities represented, but changes in the scale of the graphic, if they do not correspond to changes in the data being represented, then we have a different perception of what the meaning of this is. So if you want to read more about how charts can be misleading, then these two books, an old one by Tufte and a new one which just came out, or the newest edition just came out by Alberto Cairo. Color is another important element of visual perception. We use color to label, to categorize, to group things, to give emphasis, or to just to decorate for aesthetic purposes. But we have to be careful because we can have too much color. That's called color pollution. And also be careful of various elements of luminosity and contrast between the foreground and the background, because these may affect also our perception. Color palettes are used depending on the data types that we have, and different color palettes are appropriate for different data types. So a sequential palette, like the one that we see on top, is usually uses a single hue and varies it in terms of lightness and saturation. So lightness is generally perceived as ordered. So this makes sense for quantitative or ordinal data that have some kind of sequence to them. And in general, it's better to map higher values to the darker colors of the scale. Diverging is useful when data has a meaningful midpoint. So like when the data includes positive, negative, and positive values. And the positive and negative should have different saturated hues, while the midpoint should be a more neutral gray or white. And then a qualitative palette is best when we have nominal data. So we have separate categories that are not interrelated in some ways. So let's see an example here of the sequential use of color in a New York Times map, COVID related map, and here you can see your typical interactive map, which you can hover over different countries and get a tooltip with the information. So the palette here has a range from yellow all the way to from lighter yellow all the way to darker red, which signifies the hot spots and the cases. This is a different topic, which has to do with the elections. We will know in the United States, we will know the results by today when you're watching this video. Here we have a qualitative use of color. We have nominal data, so we have three categories, basically the political parties and the states that are solid blue or red, and then the battleground states. So three categories essentially. Here is a here is a COVID-19 related graph that shows new COVID-19 cases in Switzerland per 100,000 people in the last 14 days. And here, these are the cantons, these polygonal shapes here. The colors on the legend follow no sequential pattern here. Instead, they use a qualitative use of color with no order. And in this case, also all Swiss cantons are same sized and shaped hexagons, and this doesn't help understand at all and get a picture at all of what's going on. On the contrary, a very similar type of visualization for new COVID-19 cases in the USA by state uses the same philosophy but with fewer colors, and the colors here follow a rationale. There are only four, and they group basically categories of thresholds, I guess. Here you can see these different colors. This is a misleading use of a color scale, but it's misleading not only because of these colors, but because of the categories made. So the cases from 2,800 or so to 298,000 or so are all grouped into one category. So this gives a really different picture of the states affected in the United States, cases and deaths by county, by state, seemingly showing that not many states have been affected in the country. So continuing on with perception, it's hard to find the threes in this type of exercise here. It's slow, it's sequential, we look through each line, each number, it's conscious, whereas when the three pops out, then this is a rapid, parallel, and automatic way. It's called pre-attentive processing. Same here, which side of the two boxes has the red circle. Also here, the viewer barely has to search consciously at all before seeing the dot of interest, but that's not the case here. This time there is no variation on color, and on average, looking for the red circle is noticeably harder than before. And likewise here, it is hard and takes time to see the red circle. So if we want to summarize some do's and do nots, or do nots and do's, don't put too much in the two axes, don't truncate axes, don't use 3D unnecessarily, use luminance for detail, use color for categorization, but not too many colors. Leverage all the pre-attentive visual properties that we know of, show the data, be clear as possible, less is more, and let the data tell the story. A good example of selecting the right visual properties and elements for the types of data can be found in the very famous Gapminder, Hans Rosling's series of visualizations, where the most important data, for example here, numerical data, are depicted in terms of position. The population, which is also numerical, is shown by the area of the disks, and the continents, categorical data, are depicted using colors. If we look at some of the visualizations of the pandemics, recent ones, we can see some good examples. Here we get a very good feel of the different pandemics. For example, the Spanish flu, we hear a lot about it recently, and we can see at a glance which ones were the deadliest ones. Or here we can see how when scientists use this basic measure to track the infectiousness of a disease, the reproduction number R naught, R zero, and this tells us how many people are susceptible on average, and we can compare here the different diseases just with a glance and see that measles, for example, the bottom right one, tops the list as being the most contagious with an R0 range of 12 to 18. So this means that a single person can infect on average 12 to 18 people in an unvaccinated situation. An effective visualization, even with practically no text besides a succinctly descriptive title and subtitle, is easily understood straight away, like this one here. It's an interactive map, which means that just hovering over each country will basically pop up a tooltip with more information. And this is what Ben Schneiderman says as a mantra, that overview first and then details on demand. So you get a good overview, one look, and you understand what the situation is. And if you want to go into depth with further detail, then you can do that. This is another very recent example by the Greek government showing the various areas that are affected in Greece and what the status is, the state. And then, of course, more complicated, more complex dashboards that are more sophisticated. They combine maps and charts with interactive features so that you can track different views of the data. For example, this is a dashboard by the government in Singapore. But also line charts that provide linear and logarithmic axes to y-axis in particular, showing the daily cases in an interactive feature. And very easily one can see that the more up and right, the worse the situation. And also see how this changes throughout time. So this means that almost all tests, in this case, daily tests versus cases, it means that almost all tests you do result in confirmed cases. The more to the right and towards the top you are, the worse. An example here to compare state outbreaks. The chart graphs lines for average new daily cases and deaths against each state's totals to date, and this type of visualization highlights a state's daily growth or decline relative to the overall size of its outbreak. So when both new and total case and death counts grow quickly, the curves bend upward, and as new cases and deaths slow down, then the curves bend down. This is an interesting graph. It's quite different. The outcome of cases, recovery or death, and so two colors used here, and you can see how symmetrical they are. A different kind of visualization here showing impacts on various parts of the economy. This is from the World Economic Forum. One thing that's important to understand from all these examples is that data visualization is basically storytelling. Design choices can tell a different story. Different choices will tell a different story, and it can be a completely different story. And in some cases, combining different visualizations like this, in this case of a student of mine, can tell a story and help us compare and understand what's going on. In other cases, we have a more linear form, not interactive, but a scrolly telling story, where we scroll and we see a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and we can understand what's happening, and maybe that can touch us on a more emotional level, as in this case, where each victim of the 100,000 victims, when they were 100,000, were there was a story or a short note about each person on the New York Times interactive site. And on the Time magazine, a depiction of the 200,000 with just a few, with data that is depicted in a very emphatic and emotional way. But it doesn't need to be very complicated. Even with the simplest of representation elements, just plain lines, one can tell an effective story if the elements are chosen in such a way that represent the data in the best possible way. Thank you, and I'll take questions or comments.
I thought that was a compelling presentation, so thank you. Maria, are you with us?
Yes, indeed, I am here.
Thank you very much. What a great talk. You know, bridging the science of data and the science of communication, and showing us the techniques of communicating data. Fantastic. Right, let's go to some questions over here. The first comment, more of a comment. Really an impeccable presentation and lecture in so many aspects that there is no question coming up. This was when there was no question. Rather than need to repeat it 2 or 3 times to absorb all the info and knowledge. Thank you so much. Yes, I think your talk, or at least the video after the talk, will be a very popular video.
Thank you. And I put 1/10 of what I had as examples. There are so many coming constantly these days. Yeah,
I noticed that
it was hard to find.
You also put an indication or a question up for everyone to jump onto menti.com and fill in their feedback. So I hope you've all done that, friends. And then we have another question. Would we be able to find the result of US elections, I guess, sooner by depicting the current status of votes using big data? And what would that be? I'm not sure I understood the question, but perhaps our friend can elaborate.
I was hopeful that we will know definitely the result by now, but I guess we're hopeful, but we don't know for sure, right?
I actually on another screen over there, I have a US map that is kind of red on one in the center, and then 2 blue bits on both edges. So that big data is, I mean, that is a massive exercise in its own if you consider how many millions of votes need to be counted in such a short period of time. So hats off to those people.
But though I'm not sure I understand exactly the question either, but for example, CNN and other channels and news outlets, they give you the opportunity to actually interact with a map of the electoral, the states, and you can actually make your own election. So you can choose the states that you want or the information that you want, and you can see a real-time refreshing of the results by following that visualization. If you go to CNN.com Electoral College interactive map, if you search for that, you'll see that. So I'm not sure if that's what the question was referring to, but there are plenty of, especially in the US, plenty of visualizations that are real-time visualizations of the data as they are coming in.
Maria, I found it very especially interesting around the halfway point of your presentation, where you were talking about stretching axes and how that could be help someone mislead, or even someone could misunderstand the data. So often, I guess, charts can be used in a propagandist way. So we need to be really aware of that.
And they have been.
And they have been, absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Seeing as we're talking to developers who normally are dealing with rows of data coming out of databases, I expect it's also a very important skill set to have, to develop their skills in terms of perception, in terms of graphics, so that not only they present their data in a better way, but perhaps, there's interesting career prospects as well if you have the ability to encompass the data into charts and into a way that is more communicative, right? So I guess that's what your course at the university
Yeah, well,
focuses on?
there's a whole a domain now of data science, and there are graduate courses in Greece. There are also English, they're in the English language. So they are multidisciplinary, mostly graduate degrees in data science. And basically what you do is you learn how to interpret this data, to process the data, to clean the data in order to bring it to a form that can be communicated to a diverse audience. So one thing to do when you have tables of data, because data come in tables, right? You can have an Excel or some kind of whatever spreadsheet of data. You have to understand what your data is.
Mm-hmm.
So you can then choose the right visual properties. You can then choose whether you want to show it in, let's say, a linear or a logarithmic scale. I showed in one of the examples, Our World in Data is a very good site with COVID-19 visualizations and others. But especially now with the pandemic, it's really useful. And you are able, as a user, to choose which scale you want to see your data and choose the type of story basically that you need, the message that you need to get out of the visualization. So for example, a linear, with the same kind of data, linear scale illustrates, let's say, exponential growth because it shows absolute counts. A logarithmic scale, you just tap on you click on the logarithmic and it tells you when the rate of increase has slowed, when the curve starts to bend, for example. So it's the same data in the same chart with the same axes, but it can tell a different story, and it depends on who the user is and what they want to get out of it. So if you're a data scientist, basically you look at the data, you see what the message is that you want to give, and you then choose the representation for that data, the visual properties, the categories, the colors, depending on what your data is, if it's categorical, if it's ordinal, etc. And you go from there. So it is a step-by-step process, but you really have to understand what the data is, and you have to know who you need to communicate this data to.
Maria, thank you so much. That was a fantastic talk. I'm really glad you also kind of mentioned Hans Rosling's very famous charts. And I had my first awakening with data, big data, and the presentation of that data during that very famous TED talk by Hans Rosling. So again, thank you very much for joining. Thank you for contributing a fantastic talk. I'm sure it's going to be a very popular YouTube video beyond this event. And thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your Saturday. I hope you'll spend some time in the booths. Oh, we have another question. I'm told we have another question. Here we go.
And I should say also, before we go to the question, that I think there's a workshop just now on using R and the types of tools that we use to do these kinds of visualizations. So whoever's interested, they should attend that. I'm not taking away from the other talks. I'm not sure if it's a good idea.
Very good, very good.
But it's very relevant because what I showed is done with the tools that will be, for the most part, with the tools that are.
Absolutely. Our last question. It was a great presentation. I would like to know if you can give us some advice on how a data analyst can be sure which type of charts we should use each time for data visualization. Which types of charts, I suppose, I'm not sure
Okay, so when do we use bar charts? When do we use pie charts? I think I implied, I did have some, of course, there's so many different types of charts and there's so many different types of data. So it's hard to just, give you one sentence for each right now.
I guess practice, right?
Well, no, but there are a lot of resources out there that you can look at. So you can see where for example, I did say this in my presentation, bar charts are best when you have a lot of categories. Pie charts, well, there is this, people should not use pie charts in general, but if you must, pie chart is something that you would use when your data sums up to 100%. Otherwise, in the example that I showed, it makes no sense. It's confusing, it's misleading, because that added up to 178%, for example. So line charts are usually used when you need to plot time. So you want to see, for example, progress on a timeline, and usually your x-axis is that timeline in a line chart, and so you can see how things progress in terms of time. So you can find these resources online. There are many courses as well, but each type of chart is best for different types of data. So you really need to know this kind of information before you set out to just chart your data with anything that just pleases you, because a lot of people do start that way, and that's probably not the best way to start.
Well, thank you, Marie. I expect the best use of a pie chart is when we're actually eating the pie, and only then, and only then.
Or the pizza, yeah.
Or the pizza. So
Right.
thank you so much. Great presentation. I look forward to perhaps seeing you on the Fedora platform.
Yeah, I'll be around.
And keep up the great work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You keep up the great work, and
Fantastic.
congratulations to you all.